teens who had firsthand experiences of receiving empathy from their mothers when they were 13 were more likely to pay it forward in their close friendships when they were 13 to 19 years old. So if I have an empathic caregiver, I have a better capability as a teenager to show empathy toward my best friends. Then, what most surprised us was that ability to be empathetic in close friendships when you're a teenager predicted supportive parenting behavior 10 years later when teens themselves became parents. So we're able to see this transmission of empathy across 3 generations: mothers, teens, and those teens' children if they had children.
Welcome to Season 15 of Purposeful Empathy, a show that is dedicated to amplifying the voices of people from across the globe who understand that the world needs more empathy and are doing something about it. Thanks so much for watching. Enjoy the show. Welcome to a new episode of Purposeful Empathy. Today I'm joined by Dr. Jessie Stern, who is a psychologist, writer, educator, and relationship scientist. She completed her PhD in child development and a postdoc fellowship at the University of Virginia before returning to her home state of California to become an assistant professor of psychology at Pomona College. She has authored 50 articles and book chapters on empathy, close relationships, and mental health in children, teens, and adults. And last month, which is how she came to be on my radar, this is May of 2024, we're talking, you and some colleagues published a journal article in Child Development called Empathy Across 3 Generations, from Maternal and Peer Support in Adolescence to Adult Parenting and Child Outcomes. And it's received a ton of well-earned attention. So congratulations and welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thanks so much for having me.
Well, I'm really excited because your research has validated something that I discovered in my PhD. And I can't wait to unpack that and explore that further because I think there's so much good information for parents or future parents to sort of really sink their teeth into if they want to raise empathic children and empathic generations hence, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Excited to dive into it with you.
Beautiful. So I'll start with sort of a broad question based on your experience in research. Why do you think empathy is so important for children and teenagers these days?
I think that across generations, empathy is important because it helps us feel understood. But I think especially when you're a young person, when you're a child, you often don't have the vocabulary to put your emotions into words. And so to have an adult who's reflecting back to you some part of your experience is really useful to organize your emotions and then give you a voice to say, I'm sad or I'm upset in the future. So part of it is just that kind of mirroring and making sense of your experience when you're little and maybe have big feelings that are overwhelming. And then as a teenager, I think there's a tendency to feel like you are not well understood. And there is data showing that teens have more emotional intensity during that period of adolescence. And so to have people in their lives, whether that's a caregiver or a friend, which we can talk about, who really tap into their experience, are curious about it, are willing to sit down and listen to what they have to say. One, that's usually empowering for a teen to feel like their experience matters. And two, I think it helps them manage those strong emotions so they don't feel quite so overwhelmed.
So, okay, you know what comes up for me, especially given that you're also an educator, is that so much of what we teach kids in school is sort of like in our brains, right? They're developing their cognitive capacities, maybe some of their collaborative capacities, but I don't know how much we drill down unless you're really at a school that emphasizes social emotional learning, which is not always the case. But I feel like there's this whole landscape of our emotions that is not treated with the same degree of importance as our thinking skills, our critical thinking skills. And yet so much of our lives are emotional. We live the feelings that we have. So what I'm hearing you say is, in the absence of schools doing that for us, where we have the chance to practice sort of the language of emotions and emotional literacy, the idea that parents can play the role of reflecting back or maybe doing some guesswork potentially to suss out how a child is feeling so that they can begin to learn to be self-aware about how they're feeling and sort of unpack it for themselves. as a way of maybe self-regulating somewhere along the lines. Is that what you're talking about?
Yeah, I think that's a great way of describing it. And all of these social inputs are important. Like schools have a huge role to play. And I agree with you that social emotional learning is really at the forefront of this kind of effort to have a relational education, to have an education that's focused not just on building your cognitive abilities, but also your social capabilities. Um, but you think about the very first social interactions you have in your life, most often those are with a caregiver. And so your firsthand experiences of receiving empathy, of receiving care, are often within that dynamic of parent and child. And so if your foundation for those later social emotional skills is really solid, you've got a caregiver who seems to understand what you're feeling, reflect it back. You can see it in their facial expression that they're kind of mirroring your own sense of what you're feeling. Then your expectation of future relationships is that people understand me and I'm worthy of that kind of empathy and care. John Bowlby calls this an internal working model. This is part of what attachment is all about, right? Is that these early relationships kind of set the stage for how you approach new ones. And empathy is one part of that. If I have an empathic caregiver early on, I'm set up to have a script for how other people's emotions can be met with that kind of empathy and care. But parents aren't the only people who are shaping the way that kids and teens respond to people's emotions. Friends play a huge role, especially in adolescence, and teachers as well. So I'm so glad you brought in education.
And I want to talk about teens and those relationships in a second, but let me drill down a little further because my own research around the neuroscience of empathy is that we have neuroplasticity, brain plasticity, so we can change the neural pathways. We can prune away some that don't serve us. We can make others thicker, and I find that super hopeful that we can do that because, as you're saying, if you're born into a family where nurturing and loving and empathy is not only modeled and practiced, your neural connections will be formed quite differently than a family where there's an absence of nurturing or worse, neglect or abuse, right? So I think for those who are listening and watching the show who want to be great parents, we would think about nutritious food. We would think about where we send our kid to school and the activities that they have. But you're making a really strong case for developing this attachment to the child where the child recognizes in your face. So you're not glued to your phone, right? You're not checking your phone while your kid is telling you about their day. Like that is critical to the child's brain development and how they feel about themselves and navigating the world, right?
Yeah, I love the way you put it in neuroscience terms. So Jack Shankar from the Harvard Center for the Developing Child talks about these interactions as serve and return interactions, and they start actually in infancy. So an infant serves the parent some kind of expression like a smile, and the parent might return that by smiling even bigger. And so there's kind of this broaden and build positive emotion that's happening, or the child is crying and the parent responds to that crying with some kind of compassion or comfort. And those serve and return interactions are really important for building brains. They kind of lay the foundation for neural architecture. And on top of that, then other social experiences obviously continue to shape the brain. So it's not as though if you don't have a parent who engaged in those serve and return interactions with you, all hope is lost. I absolutely don't believe that. But it is the case that you have a head start. So you're giving your kids a head start with those serve and return interactions. And part of it is your child is learning when I have an emotion or when I signal something, that actually matters. It has an impact on the world because my caregiver responds to it. If I'm crying or if I'm in distress and there's no response or the response is negative and harsh, then my impact on the world is negative or none. Maybe my emotions don't matter because I'm not getting any response back from those signals. Especially when kids are little, all behavior is communication. There's no way that an infant is trying to manipulate the parent into showing more love or affection. They just have needs, and the only way they have to express those needs is through emotion, is through the body, is through distress signals like crying or smiling or touch. So for a parent to have those serve and return interactions, is expressing to the child, you matter, your emotions matter, and here's what you can reasonably expect from the world. You can expect that the world is responsive to you.
Mm-hmm. And to drive that home, I might drop into this conversation, this small short video. I can't remember from which year it was. You probably know of this research. This woman had, what was it called? Blank face
A
research?
still face.
Still
Yeah.
face. Right. So would you like to explain what this research is, or do you want me to do it?
I'm happy to. I love this work.
Go
Yeah,
ahead.
there's this great research by Ed Tronick, and he was trying to sort of model what happens when parents have depression. But more recent research has shown that not all parents who have depression behave this way. But what he had parents do was they would interact with their child for a few moments, their infant, and they would have this back and forth interaction. And then at some point, he'd signal to the parent to have a still face, so to stop responding to what their children were doing and to sort of drop into this blank expression. And what the kid does in response is super interesting because you think, okay, every so often a parent's going to ignore their kid, but what impact does that actually have? Parent drops into still face, and usually what you see happen in the child is they start to get very upset about it. First, they try to re-engage by being smiley or reaching or vocalizing, trying to get the parent to re-engage with them. And then when that doesn't work, they start to get really distressed. So for infants, you start to see an arched back posture, which usually means they're not comfortable. And some of them start to cry. And the point is not to distress the babies. So moms then re-engage, and usually kids recover okay. So this is not meant to be a traumatic experience, but it is meant to model what happens when somebody just shuts down in a relationship. And I think actually as adults, we have similar experiences if we're engaged with someone and suddenly they drop into their phone, or I'm texting with you and then you ghost me, right? That sense of like, what's happening? I'm going to try and re-engage you. And then when that doesn't work, it's like, hey, what the heck? So I also think that, as adults, we can empathize with the experience of that infant when somebody metaphorically has that still face to us.
It's such important research. So I'm going to drop that into the show notes for anybody who's interested in seeing a link.
Babies this young are extremely responsive to the emotions and the reactivity and the social interaction that they get from the world around them. This is something that we started studying 30, 40 years ago, when people didn't think that infants could engage in social interaction. In the still face experiment, what the mother did was she sits down and she's playing with her baby, who's about a year of age.
I'm like a girl. Oh.
And she gives a greeting to the baby gives a greeting back to her.
Yeah.
This baby starts pointing at different places in the world, and the mother's trying to engage her and play with her. They're working to coordinate their emotions and their intentions, what they want to do in the world. And that's really what the baby is used to. And then we ask the mother to not respond to the baby. The baby very quickly picks up on this. And then she uses all of her abilities to try and get the mother back. She smiles at the mother. She points because she's used to the mother looking where she points. The baby puts both hands up in front of her and says, "What's happening here?" She makes that screechy sound at the mother, like, come on, why aren't we doing this? Even in this 2 minutes, when they don't get the normal reaction, they react with negative emotions, they turn away, they feel the stress of it. They actually may lose control of their posture because of the stress that they're experiencing.
Okay. I'm here. And what are you doing? Oh, yes. Oh, what a big girl.
It's a little like the good, the bad, and the ugly. The good is that normal stuff that goes on, that we all do with our kids. The bad is when something bad happens, but the infant can overcome it. After all, when you stop the still face, the mother and the baby start to play again. The ugly is when you don't give the child any chance to get back to the good. There's no reparation, and they're stuck in that really ugly situation.
It's actually devastating to watch, and it kind of really reminds you how important it is to be present. But it's hard work to be present at all times, right? So
Yeah.
I wonder if we could talk now about teens, because the need for a sense of belonging among teens is like hyper critical. And this ghosting behavior, or the behavior of getting insufficient likes, or I don't know, there's all these apps where you can tell where your friends are and you might know that you're not part of that group going out for pizza or whatever. So how is that manifesting for adolescents?
Yeah. It's a really important point that developmentally peer relationships are especially important during adolescence. When we think about brain development, which you brought up before, infancy is often considered a sensitive period, which just means that your brain is extra plastic and responsive to the kinds of social inputs you get. And when you're an infant, a lot of those social inputs are from your caregivers. But adolescence is a second sensitive period for brain development. So once you hit your teenage years, your brain is really plastic all over again, but it's especially responsive to peers. So if you look at adolescents in an fMRI scanner, and you look at the way that they're responding to potential risks when their peer is present versus not present, their brains are doing such drastically different things when their peer is present. All that is to say, teens are really, really responsive to their peer group. And some data from our lab led by Joe Allen has shown that around mid-adolescence, around age 16, the quality of your peer relationships is actually a stronger predictor of adult mental health outcomes than your parent relationships.
Say that again.
But does it?
Say that again.
Yeah. So once you enter kind of mid-adolescence, the quality of your relationships with your peers or with your friends starts to surpass the influence of your parents on long-term mental health outcomes.
Wow.
That doesn't mean that parents don't matter. They still matter hugely, but the relative importance of your friends just is so much bigger. So for teens, the feeling of needing to belong is a fundamental need developmentally, and it feels to them existential. So if your teen is feeling left out of a group, or this person didn't invite me, or I'm being bullied, there's bias, my teacher doesn't like me, I think there's a tendency for adults to feel like they're overreacting. But in fact, they're exactly right. They're exactly right that this is so important for long-term development. That does not mean that fitting in at the cost of, being able to express your authentic self is the ticket. But true belonging and social connection, having even just one or two friends, is super important for mental health in adolescence, but also for these longer-term developmental outcomes. So all that is to say, teens are right when they express just how important their friends are to them.
And so now let's overlay social media.
Sure.
So I've been paying attention to Jonathan Haidt, who's on a book tour, saying all the uptake of smartphones follows the same trend line as all the mental health issues that we're seeing, whether it's rates of self-harm and cutting, or anxiety, depression, abuse, all these really important mental health issues. So what would you say to parents who are raising teens who are obviously users of social media? You don't want to take them off the social media. Can you anyways? I don't know. What are helpful interventions or helpful tools for parents to have at the tips of their fingers when they're trying to help their kids navigate that extraordinary landscape?
Yeah. Social media is such a huge issue and really important to grapple with. I will say that some of the trends in rising anxiety and depression among adolescents predates the biggest rise in social media. It certainly predates the pandemic. And when you look at the data on social media use and teen mental health, it's way more complicated than you would expect.
Hmm.
sometimes teens who are already feeling depressed and isolated then use social media more as a coping mechanism. So when we see that there's a correlation between social media use and depression or anxiety, we don't really know about the direction. Sometimes it's bidirectional, but teens themselves will tell you that social media is both good and bad for them, for their social relationships, for their mental health. For teens who are seeking out good information about mental health, sometimes social media is a lifeline. I can connect with peers who are also going through my experience of coming out as an LGBTQ person in a small town. I can get mental health resources that might not be available to me if my parents are gatekeepers and don't really want me seeking therapy. I can plan to meet up with some friends using this app. It's not all bad, but there is bad content out there. You know, there is social media that I think we can agree without having research is detrimental to teen mental health, like these pro-anorexia types of websites, right? And Mitch Prinstein, who is the chief science officer for the American Psychological Association, he has this wonderful health brief that parents can read. And it's got recommendations for, you know, maybe delaying your teen's access to a smartphone by just a couple of years. Doesn't mean taking it away completely, but maybe delay it till they're 16 or so. And then also some recommendations for policymakers that shouldn't be completely on parents to regulate their teens' use, right? There needs to be some kind of change to policies around tech. What can they advertise to young people? What are they not allowed to show in terms of really harmful content? So I don't think the fault, or I don't think that the responsibility is solely on parents. I do think what parents can do, though, is to check in with their teen about their experience, just as they would any type of experience their teen is having. Be curious about it, show empathy about it, learn what your teen is doing online, not in a boundary violating way, but in a way that's like, hey, I'm just curious, you know, what do you like about Instagram? What do you not like about it? Oh, wow, that really sucks. Maybe it seems like you should unfollow that person because they just seem so negative. So scaffolding some way of responding to content they don't like, I think is part of it. And the other thing is there can be some rules around when the teen is using their smartphone or using social media. So maybe as a family, we have a rule that at the dinner table, all of us, including the parents, we all put our cell phones in this basket, and this is family time. This is kind of our sacred space to just interact with each other without technology. So that might be a safe space. It could also be that there's a rule in the house that you don't take your phone into your bedroom when you're about to go to sleep at night, because one thing we know is that social media can disrupt teens' sleep, and that in turn has mental health repercussions and academic repercussions too. So I think there are small ways that, you know, parents can build some boundaries around social media use without saying this is all bad.
Yeah. Yeah. Excellent. Okay. We're going to go back into the pure empathy conversation. This has been
Great.
so illuminating. Now, in your research, you don't just ask people to self-report how much empathy they have, right? So a team of researchers actually observes empathy in action. I love that frame. What do you have participants do, and what indicators of empathy are you looking for in your research?
Yeah, I want to give a lot of credit to my co-authors. So when we did this study, it's coming from a much larger project called the Cliff Vita Longitudinal Study from University of Virginia. And there have been many generations of researchers before I was part of this project who contributed. So I want to say thank you to them, especially to Joe Allen, who led it. And it started in 1998 with a sample of 184 teens, and they were 13 years old when this started. And then every year since 1998, we've followed them by observing their interactions with their parents, their interactions with their best friend, and then later their romantic partners, and asking them about their own children if they choose to have children. So in this particular study, we looked at two interactions. One was between mothers and teens when the teens were 13. And then we also looked at how teens were interacting with their best friends every year from age 13 to 19. So 7 different time points, we're looking at how teens are interacting with their friends. And in both of those interactions, we basically ask one person to talk about a problem that they could use some help or advice about. So for teens, we say, tell your mom about a problem in your life that you feel comfortable sharing, that you want some help or advice about. And then we look at what mom does. And we're looking for behaviors like emotional engagement, staying present to what the teen is saying, showing that you're understanding, nodding, active listening. We also look for instrumental support. So if you've got a problem like, oh, I just got a bad grade on this test, maybe my response is, well, maybe I could help you study. It's providing like an instrumental support to solve the problem. But we also look for emotional support. Oh, I'm feeling really stressed about this exam. And the parent says, it's okay. It's gonna be okay. Just take a deep breath. That would be addressing the emotion, right? And then lastly, just understanding what the problem is. So identifying, oh, you're stressed about this exam, and I can tell that that's upsetting. Just being accurate in reflecting back what the problem is our fourth marker of empathy. And then we look for those same sets of behaviors in the teen when they're trying to support their friend who has a problem. So, how emotionally engaged is the teen? Do they provide instrumental help? Here's how to solve the problem. Are they able to provide emotional support, really kind of show that they care about their friend's well being? And then, do they understand the peer's problem? So, those are the main behaviors. Of course, there's more to empathy than just those four things. That's what we are able to see via behavior. And we kind of infer empathy is happening underneath. But the benefit of this approach is you're not relying on self-report, because you get a lot of parents saying, oh, I'm really empathetic, right? Or a lot of teens saying, I understand my friends completely. But when you actually observe their behavior, they're not expressing it or they're not showing it.
So from a technical standpoint, because so far I'm following, how do you do this? It's videotaped conversations, or somebody's actually in the room? Okay, so it's videotaped. And how do
Yes.
you mitigate the performance aspect of it? Yeah, I'm just curious about that.
It's a great question. So it's true. It's a really weird context, right? Because maybe I'm bringing my best friend, Anita, into this university and we're put into a room and asked to talk about something. So there is a little bit of like nervousness, I think, that some teens have. Uh, we try to mitigate that by being out of the room. So it really just feels like a conversation between two people. Of course, they're informed that they're being filmed, but we let them know that only our research team is going to see it. We're never going to show this to anybody. They don't want to see it. It's never going to be online. Like there's confidentiality. So there's some boundaries around who's going to view this. And also over time, I think teens get much more comfortable with this because they've been participating since they were 13. So it feels less awkward as they go through the study. That said, there's a certain degree to which you can't really know for sure how things are in real life, but it's one of those things that's hard to fake, and they don't know that we're looking for empathy.
Mm.
Um, and I think you can really tell when somebody is emotionally engaged in a genuine way versus putting on a performance.
Beautiful. So now I can already sense the listeners and viewers are like, Anita, just get to the point where you're asking her, what were the findings? What were the findings and what surprised you?
Sure. So we found that teens who had firsthand experiences of receiving empathy from their mothers when they were 13 were more likely to pay it forward in their close friendships when they were 13 to 19 years old.
Hmm.
So if I have an empathic caregiver, I have a better capability as a teenager to show empathy toward my best friends. Then, what most surprised us was that ability to be empathetic in close friendships when you're a teenager predicted supportive parenting behavior 10 years later when teens themselves became parents. And then in turn, those teens who are more supportive parents at least reported that their kids were more empathetic. So we're able to see this transmission of empathy across three generations: mothers, teens, and those teens' children, if they had children. But I think what was most interesting to me and most surprising was that teenage friendships were this training ground where teens were growing in their empathy capacities from age 13 to 19, and that had any bearing on their parenting behavior. We kind of know that parenting is transmitted intergenerationally, but to have something that's happening in your teenage friendships be a training ground for the way that you parent is really interesting.
So does that mean parents need to pay attention to the kinds of friends that your children are hanging out with, and to sort of elevate the friendships that you're noticing the kindness and the compassion and the empathy like present as they're putting together a grilled cheese sandwich? Or is that a big takeaway? And how do you do that, right? Because kids are going to be friends with who they want to be friends with. Or how can parents be helpful?
Yeah, I definitely think the solution is not to control who your kid hangs out with, right? But I like the way you framed it, which was to gently encourage the relationships that seem to be most socially and emotionally healthy and rewarding for the teen. And often the litmus test for a teen could be in the context of a conversation about how does hanging out with this person actually make you feel? After you've been with them, what's the feeling you have? Do you feel diminished? Do you feel shut down? Do you feel small? Or does hanging out with this person actually make you feel really grounded and authentic and joyful? And I think helping teens tease apart how a particular friendship actually causes them to think, feel, and behave helps them sort out, here's who I actually want to invest my time with. Is this person, even if they might not have as high social status, gosh, I feel like I can really be my true self with them, and I have a sense of true belonging. This other friendship where maybe I'm trying to gain social status, or I really want to be part of this group because they're super cool, but gosh, just feel like garbage after hanging out with them. So I think parents can also just help by helping the teen reflect on with whom they want to invest their time and energy. That said, if there's truly a toxic friendship where your teen is not able to extricate themselves, I do think it's important for parents to intervene when needed. But teens are at this amazing developmental point where they can actually do a lot socially themselves, and giving them those opportunities to navigate friendships with autonomy and with some sense of freedom, and like they have a choice in who they're friends with. I think that's the most empowering thing for teens. And it's a really useful adult skill to say, this is a relationship that is really positive that I want to nurture intentionally. And this is a relationship that I need to set some boundaries around because it's just not good for either of us. So empowering teens to choose those friendships that make them feel safe, seen, and supported, I think is one thing parents can do.
And I've mentioned at the top end of this conversation that your research really aligns nicely with a finding that I had from mine. So I was interviewing social entrepreneurs, these professional change makers that are the founders of nonprofits working on all sorts of social and environmental problems. And I wanted to understand if they had anything in common that would inform my thinking about pedagogy so that we could really inspire the next generation of change makers. And I didn't intend to discover this, but what came out from the research is that those change makers had service modeled in their homes. So their parents went volunteering, they took them out, they dragged them out to like whatever the volunteering was. And it was just it became part of the ethos of the family. The family dynamics was we give back to community. And that has stayed with me, certainly as a parent now. So I think it's amazing that this longitudinal study has shown the intergenerational passing down of empathic proclivity. But that, of course, engenders the question, what if you don't have that? What if you don't have that modeling in the household from a young age, at the teen years, or, yeah, what do you do then? How can it be cultivated in spite of that?
I love the research that you just shared because oftentimes these things are modeled, but for many of us, we didn't have that privilege, perhaps. And there could be so many reasons for that. There are societal and structural barriers that make parents behave in ways they wouldn't want to. And there's intergenerational trauma that we can't magically go back and fix. But there's always hope for breaking intergenerational patterns. So the word that I use with my students a lot is unless, kind of like the Lorax when he's talking about interrupting environmental degradation in that context. But the power of unless is that, yeah, these are group level correlations that we have. On average, teens who have an empathic parent are more likely to be empathetic friends, unless they maybe are able to cultivate that quality in their close friendships, or unless they have a really great mentor or a teacher who shows empathy toward them and is a different kind of model. Or maybe an unempathic parent raises an unempathic teen unless they recognize and have the self-reflective capacity to say, gosh, I want to be different from the way I was raised because I see value in cultivating my relationships in a different way. I have a very dear friend who I met when we were probably 14, and she came from a family that was not very emotionally expressive. And there were cultural parts of that and also intergenerational parts of that. And in the beginning of our friendship, she was the only one of us four girls who were all friends who didn't want to hug anybody when we said goodbye. And she didn't really initiate much vulnerability or self-disclosure. But she stuck it out in the friendship, and we're still friends about 20 years later. Is that right? That's amazing. um, we're still friends, and she is now the social instigator in our group. So even though we live in very different places now, she's the one who initiates contact. She's the one who calls people when she's not feeling great, and also when we're not feeling great. So she has sort of, through an alternative model of relationship from our friendship, she is now the person who I think has so much emotional capacity and capacity to be supportive and to be very vulnerable and strong at the same time in our friendship. So all that is to say, there are all other models beyond our family of origin that we can seek out, and that empathy is a teachable skill. It's a muscle you can build. It's something that educators can help cultivate. In addition to those other relationships that give us different models of being in the world, there's really cool research by other people showing that reading fiction is a great way to build empathy. So if you randomly assign people to read a work of nonfiction or a work of fiction, those who read the fiction are more likely to show increases in empathy over time. So there are ways to, break intergenerational cycles. Therapy is also a great one if you have the resources to get therapy. And one of the most important things is self-awareness and self-reflection. If I didn't have these great role models growing up, is there a way that I can recognize in myself when I'm emotionally settled and able to extend empathy to other people? And when are the moments where I just get triggered into an old pattern? And that reflection is one of the key moments where you have choice about whether I'm on autopilot and continuing the patterns of my past, or whether I change it in the moment.
That's great. Those are quite a few ideas to let percolate. You also mentioned training empathy. I went onto your website and I noticed you offer some courses. And I wonder if you could share a little bit about those different courses because they sound super interesting, especially the first one. I'm going to open up the website just so that it's top of mind. Hold on. The Origin Stories. Tell me about the Origin Stories course and a few others if you're interested.
Sure. So I'll just clarify that these are courses I teach to undergraduates at University of Virginia, where I was a postdoc, and then I'll be teaching a child development course similarly at Pomona. So these are college courses, and most of the folks I teach are students, so late adolescents, emerging adults. And the Origin Stories course was one that was designed as a first-year seminar. So there's an interesting kind of new curriculum that's trying to have more engagement between students at UVA. So it's a small class, and basically we learn about the fundamentals of child development with a real focus on the importance of relationships. And after every class, students journal about how the science of human development connects to their own lives. So it's called Origin Stories because everybody has one. And the hope is that you have some scientific context to understand your own experience, and to come away from the class feeling like you understand how you got here. You understand a little bit more about why you are the way you are. And then that opens up potentially an opportunity to change if you'd like. So a lot of the journals focus on who were your early role models? How did certain friendships in your adolescent years shape the way you think about yourself? Ways in which you want to parent similarly or differently from your own parents, and similar types of reflections. And these journals are really wonderful to read as an instructor because they can be in any format. They don't have to be just prose. So some students draw, some students create cartoons, some students create musical playlists that incorporate different aspects of the course. They're extremely creative. And I think that's part of what's potentially useful for them is that they can express their origin story in these different artistic ways. That's another part of empathy that we don't always think of is artistic expression as a way to convey emotion and to convey experience that transcends the way we often talk and is in some ways more impactful. If a student writes a poem about their childhood, I come away with a very visceral and emotionally engaged response in a way that I might not by just knowing the list of facts of what happened to them.
And I think it also comes kind of full circle to what we were talking about at the very beginning, which is we really, and I'm glad you have a course, I'm glad you're teaching a course like that, because we just don't spend enough time thinking about our feelings, having awareness about how we're feeling, because that's how we can actually manage and work through and transcend our feelings, right? And certainly to be able to bridge difference, right? If you're having a conversation with someone, at least if you know how you're feeling, then you can express it, and then the same person can, reveal how they're feeling and express it, and then there's a possibility for empathy and resolution around conflict. But in the absence of knowing how you're feeling about stuff and you're just reacting all the time, I feel like, we're just walking around as like big triggers. I think this work is so important.
Yeah, for sure. You made me think of this wonderful poet, Padraig Otuma, who does the Poetry Unbound podcast. And he just had a series of poems that he read and talked through about conflict resolution. His first career was in conflict resolution in Northern Ireland. And part of what he uses these poems to unpack is our biases and our ways of not seeing people. And poetry can transcend some of those barriers and biases for sure.
And I don't know if anybody has noticed, listening or watching, but I picked it up sort of maybe 3/4 of the way through. I would ask a question or make a comment and then turn it over to you. And initially it just felt good. And then I realized, oh, she's trained with this and she's doing this with, maybe you're doing it subconsciously now because it's so much part of your way of being in the world. But I would invite anybody to go back and rewind, because at every turn when I've mentioned something, when it's my turn to talk and you're listening, your first reaction is to honor what I've just said.
Mm.
Oh, what you just said was so interesting, or oh, that was such a thoughtful question. And I think I'm calling this home because as an interviewee, the fact that you care about my opinion and that you thought my question was thoughtful, just however you feel about it, maybe, a separate idea, maybe you thought it was a stupid question or I didn't articulate it well. Nonetheless, by just saying it, it made the conversation feel for me so much more rewarding. And
Mm.
so I guess going back to the very beginning, if we're able to reflect back to the person who is engaging with us, it just, I mean, imagine cortisol dropping and, all the good serotonin rising in our bodies. I have felt that way through this conversation. So you are walking the talk. And I just share it because there is very big power in us
Mm.
holding space and reflecting back. I've heard you, I've stayed present for you, I value what you say. So important. And that's a big part of empathy.
Thank you for naming that. I think the the people who I know who model that really well are therapists because they are trained, like you said. And part of it is reflective listening, where I'll take my therapist as an example. She will relay something back to me that I've just said, and then do a check-in. Is that right? Like, did I get that right? And that gives me an opportunity to say, yeah, that's exactly how I experienced this. Or, no, actually, it was a little bit more like this. And so I think part of what effective empathy is also knowing your limits. And like, I might misunderstand something that you've said, and it's okay to ask for clarification and maybe also to say, Anita, I feel like I didn't quite understand this part of your dissertation research. Like, can you walk me through that a little bit more? Or what was it like when you were interviewing social entrepreneurs? And for parents, I think that's also really huge with teenagers, to do some reflective listening, but then also check in like, did I get that right? Am I hearing you right? I think teens, feel empowered and respected by that, and they're more likely to disclose to you if they feel that you're validating their experience and also following up with some questions to really get them, and taking the time to do it.
Such a meaty conversation. I hope many people watch and listen. My last question, and thank you for being so generous with your time, is one of my favorite questions to ask because I never know what I'm going to get, and I always love it. It's delicious. If you could share, in your repertoire of lived experiences, a time when you were on the receiving end of empathy and what that meant for you.
Sure. So my dad passed away about a year ago to the day, and I was working at the time in this lab doing research on teens. And my boss, this guy, Joe Allen, who's a co-author on the paper, he, he's trained as a clinical psychologist, so he has some of these skills in his training. But two, he's just a really present person. And I had been checking in with him periodically when my dad was in the hospital, just letting him know what was going on and letting him know I'd be out of the office. And his response was just take as much time as you need. This sounds really hard. But I think the most powerful moment for me was when I returned to work, which was a weird transition because professionally you have to sort of appear okay, even if internally there's a struggle after a big loss. And I met with him individually, and the first thing he did was he acknowledged what had happened. He said, "I'm so sorry about your dad." Now, that's huge because in our culture, we have a fear of death. We don't like talking about it. We don't know how to talk about it. People are often really awkward around this issue of, oh, I don't want to say something because maybe I'll upset this person. And really, the best thing you can do is just acknowledge when someone is going through a hard time. Like, I'm so sorry this happened. It can be as simple as that. And that was kind of a doorway for me to say, yeah, this is what happened. This is the kind of guy he was. I really miss him. And then I had no way of knowing this, but he shared with me that his father had passed away when he was around the same age as me, and actually from a really similar cause. It was very sudden, and him being a little bit self-disclosing in that moment was really huge, and it made me feel seen. It didn't take away from my experience. He didn't turn the focus onto him, but he just shared a little bit that said, I've been there. And that's what made it possible for me to go back to work, I would say, was that act of kindness and knowing that somebody in a position of power was willing to extend that kind of kindness. It made me feel like I could bring my whole self to work and not have to shut down the part of me that had lost my dad.
Mm. Very poignant story. He sounds like a lovely man.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you for sharing. Would you like to share about your dad if you are interested? I'd love to know something about him.
Oh, yes. I love talking about my dad. He was always remarkably emotionally present. And I know that that was not something he was necessarily brought up with. But in his early 20s, he was living alone for the first time and extremely unhappy. So he had gotten a business degree because that's just what you did. And he had an okay career and he was doing okay. But it just felt like something was missing. And the story that he would tell me is this was back in the 70s. he would get stoned and put on a Joni Mitchell record in his apartment. And he said that listening to Joni Mitchell taught him how to feel. So here's this guy in his early 20s in the 70s who's totally moved by this music and this woman who is a poet and an artist. And at some point, he decides he's going to get therapy. I just find this so incredibly brave. And his therapist is a man who is incredibly empathetic. And what my dad would describe is he would go into a session and he would describe a really painful experience with a totally flat affect, very stoic, very masculine. And this therapist would listen to what he was saying, and on his face, he would just be so emotive of the emotion underneath what my dad was saying. And so on a particular occasion, my dad was describing something very painful, and he looks up and his therapist has just one tear coming down his face. And my dad said that that allowed him to feel sad about what he had just shared. It was like this other guy gave him permission to have emotions as a man. And he ended up going back and getting a whole different degree, having a different career, meeting my mom. So that kind of catalyzed a different life path for him. But that kind of working on yourself as a young person is so impressive to me. And I benefited from it hugely. So I feel very grateful to him and to his therapist, this guy, David Sugarman, because it had intergenerational impact.
And I love that your dad shared that story so that it's such a vivid exploration of his internal landscape. Like, you know your dad from that story.
Totally. I think when I was just out of college and also really struggling emotionally, just because that transition is hard, having his story kind of in the back of my mind was really helpful in just normalizing the experience. Like, yeah, this is hard and it's okay.
And it also just footnotes in the idea that even if you weren't raised in a family that modeled it, there's still lots of opportunity for healing and growth, and it's available if you decide you want to do that and find the resources for it. It's been such a pleasure to have this conversation with you, Jessie. Thank you.
Likewise, Anita. Thank you so much for the invitation.
Thank you for watching and listening. We'll see you next week at Purposeful Empathy. Thanks so much for watching another episode of Purposeful Empathy, a show that is dedicated to amplifying the voices of people from across the globe who understand the world needs more empathy and are doing something about it. So now the invitation is to subscribe to the channel and consider picking up a copy of Purposeful Empathy. Thanks again for watching. Have a great day.